Hi, everybody. I'm Craig with Out on Film, and I want to welcome you all again to our In Conversation series. I am really thrilled today to be talking to director Sam Feder, fresh from a fabulous debut of their new film, Heightened Scrutiny at Sundance. Sam, welcome to Out on Film.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you.
Excellent. For people who are joining us, we are screening your new film, Heightened Scrutiny, on June the 10th at 7 o'clock at Landmark. The details and links will be below in the show notes. And so I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation with you ahead of the screening. So tell us, Sam, a little bit about how you came to tell this story, Heightened Scrutiny, that follows Chase Strangio as he is arguing this case before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's always a confluence of events that lead to starting a film, let alone actually making it. I made a film that came out in 2020 that was called Disclosure. And that film was inspired by the rise of trans visibility that we had witnessed in 2014. And I started making Disclosure in 2015. And I was concerned that that rise of trans visibility was happening too quickly and being misused and misguided. And I was worried about that backlash that would ensue because we were seeing, with that rise of visibility, we were seeing a rise of social and legislative violence. And so Disclosure was really about, kind of a warning story that backlash is coming. And this is why, because people understand who we are only through these films and TV shows that they've been watching their whole lives. And it's going to be ugly. It's going to be nasty. And how are we going to prepare for it? And so, maybe it was a year and a half or 2 years after Disclosure, we started really seeing an uptick in the legislative violence, right? These
Right.
anti-trans bills. We show those statistics, we talk about those statistics in Heightened Scrutiny. But what happened was I was starting to get a sense that the media had something to do with this shift in narrative. And I started tracking that, but other things were happening at the same time. The New York Times, about 150 New York Times contributors, I'm sorry, I think it was about 15,000 New York Times contributors signed an open letter telling the New York Times that there are a number of articles that are based on lies that are not well researched, that are not fact checked, and that they're leading to anti trans laws because we're seeing these briefs, these legal briefs, actually quote the New York Times,
Right.
but not only the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal. They're using reporters' opinion, basically, because even opinion pieces are supposed to be fact checked and they often aren't. And there were opinion pieces in some of this legislation to pass these anti trans bills. And that was really terrifying to learn. Um, at that same time, and now we're about in February 2023, that Michael Knowles clip started circulating from CPAC, where he says transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. And that was upsetting to hear, but I have a pretty thick skin around this
Right.
stuff. But what happened was the camera then panned across the audience and seeing a mass of people who just are ordinary looking people clapping to that sent chills. That kind of rocked me to the core in a way that I hadn't felt over all these years. And then about a month later, I was working on a television set, and a senior crew member confided in me that she didn't think kids knew if they were trans. Like she couldn't buy it. And her example was that she didn't know her sexuality until puberty and she was straight. And, how can these kids know they're trans at such a young age? And I was in shock, that she was telling me this. And we were on a queer trans show,
Right.
right? And she then just started to list all these sort of right wing talking points. It's a trend, it's not safe, it's, what about the parents' rights, right? And it's like these that ideas had really been confined to like Fox News for so long, but these were now the talking points for mainstream media. And I got really scared that, my colleagues, once my strongest allies, had now joined the likes of Knowles, right, in questioning legitimacy of healthcare. So I set out to tell a story about that relationship between the mainstream media and these laws. And then I wanted to have a storyline that really showed the material consequences. And I was in conversation with a few people, but then when it was announced that the case was going to be going to the Supreme Court, Chase and I started talking about working together. So I started making the film in March. I did a bunch of interviews that you see in the film, and then started following Chase in July. And then we finished filming December 4th and then premiered in January. It was a very quick turnaround.
So for people to set the scene, the matter that Chase is arguing before the court that you're following in the film is Skrmetti, which is a case coming out of Tennessee banning, challenging the bans on gender affirming healthcare for minors.
Correct.
And that's the case before the court. And, as I was kind of watching the film, and I don't want to, it doesn't feel like necessarily a follow-up to disclosure, but more of a
It is.
continuation, but more
Oh,
of a
okay.
continuation of the
Yeah.
dialogue that you're
Yeah.
starting in disclosure about how trans people are represented in film and TV, to how trans people are now represented in media, specifically. I'll get in trouble for this, but this mythical liberal leaning media. Um, and it
Wow.
always comes down to they're always hiding behind the children. And this is an age-old trope that they pull out every single time in my lifetime, starting in the 70s with Anita Bryant, Save the Children, all the way through the Bush years of gays will steal your children, to now with trans youth and trans people, that there's like what you kind of describe in the media is that one, there's this lack of asking any questions and just kind of simplistic view that, as you say from your colleague, that is this really real? That trans is a choice, and it feels like we're back here, the same conversation we have over and over again. Can you kind of tell me this whole kind of focus on hiding behind the children?
I mean, it's just so easy to say you want to protect children, right? Because who
Right,
wants to hurt children?
right,
Like, it's kind of, you're just set up to lose that conversation. Um, but the problem is the children don't have a voice in that,
right.
right? And so we've had this national conversation about a community that is not given a voice. And so then it's about whether or not the parents have the right to make informed decisions with
Right.
their medical care team about their child. And it's the easiest thing to start to poke holes in, because I think what we've seen, what the liberal media has done, the liberal media,
Right.
the centrist slash
This
claiming
mythical.
to be liberal media, um, is they have sort of unleashed this permission to show bigotry, right?
Right.
Because you can soften your bigotry when it's about the children, right?
Right.
And then people start to think about their own children, and then their transphobia kind of starts to simmer. Whereas they maybe were celebrating seeing Laverne Cox, on all these
Right.
shows, because right, but suddenly they don't want their kids to come home as trans. So
Right.
then it becomes a really easy way to to express your bigotry, disguised as protection.
Which really the conversation comes down to that everybody is kind of fluffing around with this kind of simplistic view of hiding behind the children, and suddenly you come home trans, and you're on medication or whatever they think is going to happen. um, but that has far-ranging consequences because this really boils down to bodily autonomy for all of us.
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
and the state or the government coming in and imposing on us, children, gay people, trans people, anybody, this is all comes down to bodily autonomy that all of this press seems to miss. Is that a fair assessment from your
Yeah,
perspective?
no, absolutely. I mean, I think what people are missing right now is that this case is going to impact the constitutional rights of everyone, of all Americans, right? That this effort to ban healthcare for trans people is part of a larger trend of politicians interfering with any private medical decision of all patients and their doctors, right? I mean, I think the community was the trans community, maybe some people in the queer community were very aware that this, positioning of protecting the children was going to very easily spill over to all trans people. And we're seeing that, like that already happened, right? With Medicare, Medicaid, I always forget which is which. And we're starting to see that in many aspects of our society. And so, but it's not going to stop there. And that's what I just think people are missing. The larger population is just missing that. And they think this is just about a small community and has nothing to do with them. But everyone is going to start to lose their rights to having private decisions made, and also to, like you said, like once you chip away at anyone's right to make a decision about their body, you're chipping away everyone's right.
Right.
And so it's terrifying. And I don't think, and that's what I really want this film to be able to reach those people who think this has nothing to do with them.
Right.
And realize that if we don't start coalition building now, like we're all going to lose.
And and we bear responsibility in our own community. I mean, there are plenty in our own community who are not, if I'm being generous, overly supportive of trans rights and what is going on, not just with the legislation, but the violence against trans people, right, and the intense focused violence on trans people now. Coalescing around in our own community.
Yes.
Realizing what the consequences are for all of us. And we've been here before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very sad. There's always infighting in marginalized communities. I mean, there's infighting in every community, but I think it's particularly sad in a marginalized community when you start to see people eating their own. And in the queer community, we've seen it from the beginning, the assimilationists and then the non-assimilationists. It's like everyone wanted to protect there were always a group of people who think they need to protect their rights by pushing others to the margins. I mean, even HRC at one point didn't want to support trans people because they thought it would distract. Right. And they didn't, that, right. And so it's like these things do not go away. And there are a lot of outspoken queer people, I don't know how they identify as like gay, lesbian, queer, who are saying the same thing, that this conversation is distracting from what queer people are facing. And that is so misguided. It is such a misguided idea.
Which I think is what resonated so much for me with this film, because I wanted to then shake people like, don't you see that this affects all of us?
Yeah.
We are all in this together. What happens to one of us happens to all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's often missed in these conversations is if the most marginalized gets their rights, then everyone is going to get their rights.
Right. Everybody gets it.
And it's like, but it doesn't trickle down. It actually trickles up.
Right.
And I think, it's people really have to start to understand that in a really tangible way now or at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears just slightly and talk about you as a filmmaker and a storyteller. And just to hear from you kind of how you chart your evolution as an artist, as a storyteller from, you started a dialogue with Boy I Am, and then we moved to Kate Bornstein, and then Disclosure, and now Heightened Scrutiny, and this conversation kind of weaves through all of those works. How do you see and describe your own evolution as a storyteller as you kind of further these conversations and dialogues that you've started?
That's a really nice question. I'm really flattered that you know of my previous work. I mean, I think there's a lot to think about with that as a storyteller, and how I've changed my objectives and my priorities and the craft of it. But I mean, the most clear thing for me is that each film is continuing the conversation, as you said. And my work is always about community, and with the focus on urgent trans issues, but it's always about the conversations within the community or at least the first two were about the conversations within the community and kind of looking at that infighting and sort of
Right.
understanding early on that we will not going to survive if we have this
Right.
infighting. And then, that my first film was about this infighting around trans guys, basically, and then lesbians and dykes in the didn't want trans guys to stay in their communities. So that was scary. And then with Kate Bornstein, it was a continuation of like, okay, if we can survive being ousted, how do we grow up? And
Right.
and let's look at Kate Bornstein and how has she made it so far in this world and so successfully. And then when I was finishing Kate Bornstein, I think there's a quote in the Kate Bornstein film where she says, "We're still flying under the radar." Right. And now's the time that she said, we need to rally around the children.
Right.
She's, she's amazing, right? She's
Yeah.
saying this. And then, as I'm touring with Kate Bornstein, that's when like the trans visibility explosion
Right.
happened. And then that's when I started to get terrified. So I realized that the conversation now needs to go outside of the community. So that, and obviously the community is always my first audience, but it needed to go outside the community for everyone to understand, right? So each film has been in response to the other, and often the craft of it is also in response to the previous
Okay.
one, right? So, Boy I Am was my first film, but actually like the first time I ever like picked up a camera. Like for me, I
Okay.
thought of this thing I was wanting to talk about, but I didn't think anyone was going to watch it. I was just like, this will be interesting to make. Um, and then, but it was all, sit down, really close up shots. I mean, there's some shots that aren't even white balanced, it was really clearly a first timer film. Um, but but I was lucky and people were interested in the conversation and that one, it continues to screen today. But then when I made the Kate Bornstein film, I really wanted to think more about the craft and wanted to make something pretty, and so there was more movement in the film. I used digital and I used high aid and I worked with a really incredible composer, and I just put a lot more intention into the craft as a different way, and it was more lyrical and nonlinear, so I really wanted to play with that. But then when I was with Disclosure, I realized like I have to use a conventional format. I have to go
Okay.
back to that. But I wanted it to look a lot better than Boy I Am, so then it was like a marriage of like the intention around the aesthetic and, this really important content. Um, and then with Heightened Scrutiny, I kind of mirrored that Disclosure interview situation where we make a really beautiful set and everyone's in front
Right.
of that set and there's a reason for everything we make on the set. But it was really important to have movement with the observational storyline.
So as we kind of we center in heightened scrutiny, I think we need to really kind of acknowledge and celebrate Chase,
Mm.
the first openly trans man to argue before the Supreme Court, trans person to argue before the Supreme Court, and this just kind of acknowledge and talk through the significance of that. Somebody representing himself and the community. And for people who are not familiar with the court, you don't just waltz in and take a case to the Supreme Court. It's a thing. um,
Yeah, it's a thing.
it's a thing. And talk through a little bit from your perspective, the significance of Chase taking this on and arguing this case.
I mean, the first thing that came to mind when I learned that he'd be arguing it was like there was Thurgood Marshall, there was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and now there's Chase Strangio. And the significance of each of those people are being a first, which is a lot of pressure, and there's a lot to unpack of being a first, but also the importance of being able to be the expert of your own community, right? And talking and defending and being in conversation about something that you have a stake in, you can't go home and walk away from it.
Right.
And so you bring so much more to your craft, whether it's film, whether it's your legal craft, whether it's medical, there's so much more is brought. And there's just a sensitivity that you can't create. And so, Chase has a brilliant legal mind.
Right.
He's, an
Right.
incredible lawyer. So the significance I don't think is lost on anyone of what it meant for there's a scene in the film of we watch him walk into the Supreme Court, the side door. And in real life, and when I watch it, that scene moves me the most because it's just because he has to walk alone and there's security guards like, watching him walk
Right.
and the door closes and you're picturing him walking up the steps alone and walking into the Supreme Court, right? Which very few people get to see in real life.
Right.
There's no video of it. And it was overwhelming to think about what he had to carry into that room and what that must have felt like. So yeah, I mean,
I mean, as the film opens and he says, "May it please the court," I just was like,
right.
it's
Even then, it's just like,
it's just like you feel the significance of that because of how it's one of our own
it's one of our own.
taking
Yeah,
up our own case.
a murder case.
Which is you feel that from the very beginning, and
Right.
so it's quite a moving way of starting.
Thank you. Thank
It's
you.
a moving way of
Yeah,
starting that.
we didn't get that footage. That was the audio from December 4th. And at that point, we were planning on just bringing in the footage of the rally, on the last
Right.
day. But when I heard the audio, I was like, we've got to figure out a way to incorporate it, and, thank God my editor was like down to try, even though we've already made the whole film. But,
Right.
I thank you for pointing that out because that felt to us like a really great way to bring people into the weight of this film and how important it was.
Um, and it's we kind of start to wrap up here. At Out on Film, we place a premium on representation. It's what we are about in queer representation in film, to celebrate queer and trans and gay storytellers, um, and talk from your perspective the importance of we own our own stories. We tell our own stories. We tell them in front of and behind the camera. From a filmmaker's perspective and an artist's perspective, kind of let our audience know kind of the importance and the significance of the premium that we all place on owning and telling our own stories.
You know, I don't want to live in a world where we are all relegated only to tell our own stories.
Right.
But when you have been misrepresented for so long and the ideas and the images of you have been so distorted and skewed to a very negative place, you have to course correct, right? And if you don't course correct, it's going to continue in that vein, regardless of how many rights we gain. And like we were saying, of the significance of having a trans person defend this case, it's the same. Like there is a sensitivity and a lived experience that is the only way to have an expertise on storytelling about your community. And also we trust each other in a way. There's a comfort in a way that when people helicopter in and they know they're going to helicopter out, they're
Right.
just not going to bring that sensitivity at this moment, right? And that being said, not all queer and trans filmmakers do it right.
Right.
But I do think it's important that we all feel empowered and entitled to tell our own stories first and foremost.
And if you think, about the film, you are on the festival circuit, so the film is playing around the country. Um, as you think about it, what is one thing that you hope audiences take home from the experience of this film?
Um, can I tell you four things that I want people to take
Absolutely.
home?
Or
I wish I could make short films so I could answer it with one thing, but I can never keep it short. I mean, I want people to know that there are 9 judges deliberating the fate of whether trans youth in Tennessee and beyond are going to have access to life-saving healthcare. Like just to picture that, 9 people are making that decision. I want people to know that this is going to impact the constitutional rights of all Americans, like we talked about earlier. I want people to understand and see how this moment is absolutely grounded in popular culture, mainstream media discourse, and social media discourse. And I want them to understand how that has misled so many people into thinking it is legitimate to be skeptical of our right to healthcare, and how the mainstream media covered those issues to our demise, right? And so those are the four things I really, those are three. Oh, the fourth thing I want some people to know is that, you know, this film is about the law and the media, but it's nice when you have legal rights. Sometimes
Yeah,
it's helpful, but the
yeah,
law is and will never be the beginning or end of how we survive and thrive. And I think that is the biggest takeaway from both Chase and Mila, the 13-year-old girl, trans girl in the film, is that you see how we are have and always will take care of each other.
right. We will not be erased.
We won't.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, Sam. Sam, thank you for sharing your time with us here at Out on Film, and sharing this film with our audience here. We are very excited to screen it. I think it's a very important film. I think it's a very moving film. And I want to thank you for making it and sharing it with all of us here.
Thank you so much, Craig, and thank you to everyone who goes to see it.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation with Sam Feder. Again, the film is Heightened Scrutiny, and all of our screening information will be in the show notes below. So go forth and remember that we will not be erased, and this is a queer revolution.
Thanks, Craig.